In the bustling streets of 16th century Istanbul, a quiet revolution brewed, not in palaces, but in smoky, dimly lit coffee houses. Men gathered to sip the bitter black drink, play chess, recite poetry, and debate politics. These cafes became hubs of gossip, satire, and dissent, so powerful that Sultan Murad for once declared public coffee drinking punishable by death. To the Ottoman elite, coffee houses weren't just places of leisure. They were threats to social order, breeding ground for rebellion and radical ideas. Yet despite bans, raids, and religious condemnation, the coffee house culture thrived, shaping public discourse and laying the groundwork for civil society in the Islamic world. In the highlands of Yemen, where terraced fields climbed the rugged slopes and mist drifts over ancient villages, a small evergreen shrub gave birth to a global revolution. Its fruit, modest and red, looked little different from a cherry. Yet within its seeds lay a substance that would alter the rhythms of human society, rewire conversations, and forge new institutions of sociability, the coffee bean. Long before the grand coffee houses of Istanbul bustled with poets, merchants, and dissenters, coffee was a local plant known only to the peoples of Ethiopia and southern Arabia. Its journey from the Sufi zawiyas of Yemen to the imperial capital of the Ottomans was one of transformation, from humble stimulant to sacred ritual, from personal solace to social phenomenon. The story begins across the Red Sea in Ethiopia, where legend tells of a goat herd named Kaldi who noticed his flock dancing with strange vigor after nibbling the red berries of a certain bush. Whether or not Kaldi truly existed is uncertain. Historians caution us with the reminder, this information has not been verified, but it is likely that the Oromo and other Ethiopian peoples consumed the plant in some form long before its wider fame, crushing the beans with animal fat to form energy-rich balls. What is certain is that by the 15th century, coffee had crossed the sea into Yemen, where its destiny took root. Yemen was not merely a stopover. It was a crucible. There, in the cool highland city of Mocha, coffee was first cultivated systematically, harvested, roasted, and brewed into a drink. Mocha would lend its name to the beverage itself, and for centuries, its port would dominate the world's coffee trade. But before commerce came devotion, and the earliest drinkers of coffee were not merchants but mystics. The Sufi orders of Yemen found in coffee a companion for their long nights of prayer and remembrance. In Sufi practice, night vigils were central. Hours of chanting, recitation, and meditation that stretched until dawn. Fatigue was an enemy of devotion, and coffee, with its power to sharpen the mind and banish drowsiness, became a sacred aid. To sip the dark brew was to renew the spirit, to remain awake to God when the world slept. The steaming cup was not yet a social pastime, but a ritual vessel, a tool for transcendence. In the zawiyas of Yemen, coffee was sanctified as fuel for spiritual ecstasy. From Yemen's monasteries, coffee spread to its markets. Merchants carried roasted beans along the caravan routes that linked the Arabian Peninsula to the wider Islamic world. Pilgrims on the Hajj to Mecca encountered the strange, invigorating drink and carried tales of it homeward. By the late 15th century, coffee was common in Mecca and Cairo, where its popularity grew among students, scholars, and traders. It offered a sober alternative to wine, which Islam forbade, and a stimulant well suited to the rhythms of urban life. In the narrow streets of Cairo's bustling quarters, small stalls began serving the drink in simple bowls. These proto-coffee houses were modest, often little more than wooden benches and steaming pots. Yet they were revolutionary in their effect. People lingered, conversed, and debated under the stimulus of the bean. For the first time, a beverage became the anchor of a new kind of gathering, neither wholly private nor entirely public, but something in between. A seed of transformation had been planted, but Yemen and the early cities of Islam were also gateways to controversy. Coffee's very effects, its stimulation, its capacity to prolong wakefulness, its power to animate conversation, drew suspicion. Religious scholars debated whether it was lawful, halal, or forbidden, haram. Some argued that, like wine, it altered the mind and encouraged frivolity. Others countered that it sharpened rather than dulled, aiding devotion rather than corrupting it. In Mecca in 1511, conservative jurists briefly banned coffee, claiming it encouraged disorder. Yet the ban was soon lifted after higher authorities intervened. Coffee had already become too deeply woven into the fabric of social and spiritual life to be uprooted. By the mid-16th century, coffee's path was clear. From Yemen, shipments left through the port of Mocha, carried by dhows across the Red Sea to Egypt, by caravans northward to Syria, and eventually to the imperial capital of Istanbul. Ottoman control over the Arabian Peninsula meant that the sultans and their merchants gained direct access to this lucrative trade. Coffee, once the drink of Sufi mystics, was about to become the drink of empires. The arrival of coffee in Istanbul was transformative. The city, already a crossroads of East and West, absorbed the bean into its cosmopolitan culture. The Ottomans did not invent the coffee house, but they perfected it, creating spaces of elegance and ritual unmatched in the Islamic world. Here, coffee left behind its ascetic associations and entered the realm of society, becoming not only a stimulant but a stage for politics, art, and community. The Kahvehain, the Ottoman coffee house, was born. The significance of this transition cannot be overstated. A bean that had once sustained solitary mystics now sustained entire publics. A ritual once confined to prayer halls now spilled into the streets, into the very heart of urban life. Coffee was no longer simply a drink. It was a force reshaping how people met, conversed, debated, and imagined themselves in relation to power. In this shift from Yemen to Istanbul lay the birth of an institution that would come to embody both fellowship and dissent. Thus, the strange bean from Yemen set into motion a chain of transformations. From Ethiopian hillsides to Yemeni zawiyas, from Meccan debates to Ottoman palaces, coffee traveled as both commodity and culture. It was never neutral. It carried meanings with every sip. Sacred for Sufis, suspect for jurists, exhilarating for merchants, and alluring for rulers, it was both revered and feared. By the time it reached Istanbul's shores, it was already a paradox, a drink of devotion and of danger, of piety and of pleasure. The story of Ottoman coffee houses cannot be told without this beginning. For it was in the mountains of Yemen that the bean became more than sustenance. It became a symbol. And from that symbol would grow an institution so powerful that sultans would try to ban it, poets would immortalize it, and ordinary men would use it to imagine new worlds. The journey had begun, and with it, the Ottoman Empire would soon discover that in every steaming cup lay both community and revolution. By the mid-16th century, Istanbul was the beating heart of an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Its markets bustled with silks from Persia, spices from India, furs from Russia, and grain from the Black Sea. Minarets pierced the sky, the call to prayer wove through crowded streets, and the Bosphorus glimmered with ships bearing goods and ambitions from every corner of the Ottoman world. Into this already vibrant city came a new commodity from the south, coffee. The bean from Yemen had already stirred devotion in Sufi zawiyas and controversy in the holy cities, but in Istanbul it would find its true stage. Here, coffee was not merely consumed. It was ritualized, commodified, and institutionalized in the form of the Kahvehain, the Ottoman coffee house. The first coffee houses in Istanbul appeared around 1554 or 1555, when 2 merchants from Aleppo and Damascus, named Hakem and Shams according to some chronicles, opened establishments in the Tahtakali district near the bustling Grand Bazaar. Their innovation was simple but profound. Rather than selling beans for private use, they created a space where men could gather to drink coffee together. They provided not only the beverage but the atmosphere, the social fabric that turned a solitary cup into a communal ritual. From this modest beginning, an empire of conversation was born. The Kahvehain was unlike any other institution in the city. Mosques were places of worship, bazaars of commerce, hammams of cleanliness and relaxation. The palace was for politics, the home for family. But the coffee house was a hybrid space, public yet intimate, sacred in ritual yet secular in content. Inside, men sat on wooden benches or low divans, sipping from small cups of thick, black liquid, its surface sometimes gleaming with oil, its taste bitter yet addictive. Servants poured from brass ewers, brewing over charcoal braziers. The preparation itself became an art, with the foam on the surface considered a mark of quality. But the Kavahain was not about the drink alone. It was about what the drink enabled: conversation. Coffee sharpened the mind, prolonged wakefulness, encouraged talk. Men gathered not only to refresh themselves, but to speak of business, of poetry, of philosophy, of politics. Oral culture, already rich in the Ottoman world, found a new home here. Storytellers recited epics, poets exchanged verses, shadow puppeteers entertained with comic dramas. Scholars debated law, while ordinary men gossiped about imperial policies or neighborhood affairs. In a society where official channels of discourse were tightly controlled, the coffee house became a forum for voices otherwise unheard. The clientele of these early coffee houses was diverse. Merchants stopped between transactions, janissaries lingered after drill, scholars and clerks found respite from their duties. The Kavahain was an equalizer, at least among men. Wealth mattered less than wit, rank less than rhetoric. A shopkeeper could find himself conversing with a judge, a janissary with a poet. Coffee houses created what some modern historians have called a public sphere, a place where information flowed, where opinions formed, where society itself reflected on its condition. Authorities noticed this immediately and with suspicion. For the Ottoman sultans and their viziers, the Kavahain was both useful and dangerous. Useful because it concentrated men in visible places where they could be watched. Dangerous because it concentrated men in visible places where they could talk. Conversation is not easily contained, and in the smoky interiors of Istanbul's coffee houses, whispers of dissatisfaction, satire, and sedition mingled with the aroma of roasting beans. The empire's rulers recognized that these were not just houses of coffee. They were houses of discourse, potential seedbeds of unrest. Yet despite periodic anxieties, the coffee house flourished. By the end of the 16th century, they dotted Istanbul's neighborhoods, each with its own character. Some became centers for particular professions, porters in one, scribes in another, janissaries in yet another. Others specialized in certain entertainments, storytelling, shadow plays, or games like tavla, backgammon, and chess. Each Kavahain was both a reflection of its community and a stage for the broader culture of the empire. Travelers from Europe were astonished. To Venetians and Frenchmen who visited Istanbul, the coffee house seemed exotic, democratic, and faintly dangerous. They marveled at the bitter drink, at the endless conversations, at the performances that unfolded nightly. Many would later carry tales of these establishments back to their homelands, planting the seeds of Europe's own café culture. In this sense, the Kavahain was not only an Ottoman institution but the progenitor of a global phenomenon. The physical design of the coffee house reinforced its purpose. They were not grand halls but modest, open spaces, accessible to ordinary men. Carpets lined the floors, braziers glowed with coals, the smell of coffee mingled with smoke from oil lamps. Cups clinked, dice rattled, voices rose and fell. Time in the Kavahain moved differently, slower, more deliberate, marked not by the hours of the clock but by the number of cups consumed, the length of a debate, the arc of a tale. It was a space outside the formal rhythms of mosque and market, a pause in the relentless pulse of urban life. Yet it is important to note that these were exclusively male domains. Women drank coffee in homes, where it became an essential part of hospitality, but they did not frequent the Kavahain. This gendered separation shaped Ottoman society. The coffee house was both a place of equality among men and a marker of exclusion. The culture that flourished there was powerful but partial, reflecting only part of the empire's social fabric. By the late 16th century, the coffee house was firmly established as a pillar of Ottoman urban life. It had traveled far from the Sufi zawiyas of Yemen. What had begun as a stimulant for prayer had become a stimulant for conversation, creativity, and even dissent. The Kavahain was no longer simply a place to drink. It was a place to think, to imagine, to belong. This birth of Istanbul's coffee houses marked the beginning of an institution that would endure bans, inspire poetry, provoke fear in rulers, and spread across continents. They were small rooms filled with smoke and chatter, yet within them pulsed the lifeblood of a society in transition. The empire would never look at a cup of coffee the same way again. If the Kavahain was the stage, The ritual of the cup was its central performance. In the Ottoman world, coffee was never simply consumed, it was enacted. Each detail, from the grinding of the beans to the serving of the brew, carried meaning. To drink coffee was to participate in a choreography of gestures, aromas, and expectations, a ritual that turned a humble bean into a cultural symbol. The Ottomans did not invent coffee, but they transformed it into an art, embedding it into their daily rhythms, their ceremonies, and their very sense of refinement. The preparation of coffee began with the roasting of beans. Merchants brought them into Istanbul by caravan and ship, most often from Yemen, carried through the port of Mocha. In workshops and kitchens, beans were roasted over open fires in shallow pans, stirred constantly to release their oils. The smell of roasting coffee was pungent and unmistakable, filling entire streets with its fragrance. For many, the scent alone was intoxicating, an invitation that drew men into the kavahane as much as the promise of conversation. Once roasted, the beans were ground, at first with mortars and pestles, later with specialized mills. The grinding had to be fine, almost powder-like, to release the full strength of the bean. This powder was placed into a small brass or copper pot called the sezv, along with cold water and often sugar. The sezv was set over a bed of glowing charcoal, and the coffee was heated slowly, brought almost to a boil, then removed, then reheated, a process repeated to coax out its thickness and foam. For the Ottomans, the foam was crucial. A well-prepared cup was crowned with a dark, creamy froth, a sign of both skill and respect for the drinker. Serving coffee was itself ritualized. The tiny cups, called fincan, were often set into holders of porcelain, silver, or brass, depending on the status of the guest. Wealthy households commissioned elaborate sets, sometimes adorned with jewels or intricate calligraphy. In kavahanes, the vessels were simpler, but no less respected. To serve coffee was an act of hospitality. To receive it was an act of honor. In homes, wives prepared and served coffee to husbands and guests, while in public coffee houses, servers known as kavasi carried steaming cups on small trays, balancing them deftly among the chatter and games. Coffee was drunk slowly, in sips. Its taste was bitter, softened sometimes by sugar, but never by milk, a practice alien to Ottoman custom. The bitterness itself became part of the cultural language. To offer coffee, as black as hell, as strong as death, and as sweet as love, became a proverb, expressing both the drink's potency and its symbolism. A shared cup was an act of trust. A bitter cup, a gesture of truth-telling. A sweetened one, a symbol of affection. Coffee thus carried meanings far beyond its flavor. Ritual extended into courtship and marriage. In Ottoman households, prospective brides demonstrated their refinement by preparing coffee for their suitors and families. To make good coffee was a mark of competence, patience, and grace. In some traditions, a bride would even prepare one cup with salt instead of sugar, testing her suitor's tolerance and humor. To drink it without complaint was a sign of respect and commitment. Thus, the ritual of the cup became interwoven with the rituals of life itself. In the kavahane, the ritual took on communal form. Men gathered, ordered their cups, and lingered for hours. Coffee was the anchor of their gathering, the constant in an ever-shifting sea of conversation, games, and performances. Cups were refilled endlessly, each serving punctuating the rhythm of discourse. Storytellers would pause for sips between episodes, poets between verses, players between moves of tavla or chess. The ritual of the cup structured the social time of the kavahane, as important as the words spoken or the dice thrown. Religious attitudes toward this ritual remained ambivalent. Some jurists, as noted in earlier chapters, worried that coffee's stimulating effects blurred the line between sobriety and intoxication. Others saw in its ritualized preparation a discipline akin to prayer, precise, repeated, meaningful. Sufi orders continued to drink coffee in night vigils, sanctifying its role as an aid to devotion. In this way, the ritual of the cup straddled the line between sacred and profane, between worship and leisure. Foreign visitors marveled at the ceremony. European travelers in the 16th and 17th centuries wrote descriptions of Ottoman coffee service, noting its elegance and precision. The French physician Jean Chardin described coffee as the most sober drink in the world, praising the civility of the ritual. Venetians carried home not only beans but the practice of preparing them in Ottoman style, paving the way for Europe's café culture. To outsiders, the ritual of the cup was exotic, but also alluring, a symbol of refinement and mystery. Over time, the ritual became so ingrained that to refuse a cup was almost unthinkable. Coffee was offered in business negotiations, in moments of hospitality, in reconciliation after conflict. To sit without coffee was to sit incomplete, as though something essential to human connection were missing. The Cafés provided not just a drink, but a rhythm, a pace of life measured in sips and foam. The ritual also contained an element of secrecy and resistance. In times when authorities sought to ban coffee houses, men continued to gather quietly, brewing in homes and back rooms, maintaining the ceremony even when it was forbidden. To prepare and share coffee was thus also an act of defiance, a way of claiming space for conversation and community against official suspicion. In the Ottoman imagination, the cup came to symbolize both order and danger. Order, because it was ritualized, codified, dignified. Danger, because it created a space for words, thoughts, and critiques that could ripple into sedition. A steaming seive was never just a pot of liquid. It was a crucible of possibility. By the 17th century, the ritual of the cup had fully matured. It shaped daily life in Istanbul and across the empire, extending from the Sultan's palace to the humblest Cafés, from the hearth of the merchant's home to the gatherings of soldiers and scholars. Coffee had become more than a beverage. It was a cultural performance, a language of hospitality, a symbol of sociability, and a medium of resistance. Every cup told a story, and every sip carried the weight of tradition and transformation. Thus, the ritual of the cup was not merely about taste. It was about belonging, about being part of a community bound by a shared act. In the act of brewing, serving, and sipping, the Ottomans turned coffee into culture. And from this culture, the Cafés would grow into an institution both celebrated and feared, a place where society itself was brewed alongside the coffee. When coffee houses began to spread across Istanbul in the mid-16th century, they quickly became known not just as places to drink, but as places to talk. The Ottomans themselves gave them a telling name, Mektep-i Irfan, schools of knowledge. To enter a Café was to enter a hall of voices, a house of conversation where men gathered not simply to sip the bitter, black drink, but to share words, ideas, and stories that carried through the city like the aroma of roasting beans. The social fabric of the empire was stitched together by oral culture. In a society where literacy was limited and printed books rare until the 18th century, knowledge circulated in speech. The mosque sermon, the street poet's recitation, the shadow puppeteer's play, all carried news, morality, satire, and wit. The Cafés gave this oral culture a permanent home. Here, conversations could stretch for hours, enlivened by the stimulant in every cup. The coffee house was a hearth for language, a forge for opinion, and a mirror for society itself. Inside these smoky, lamp-lit rooms, the atmosphere hummed with discussion. Merchants debated prices and trade routes. Clerks exchanged news of the bureaucracy. Janissaries traded stories of the barracks, and poets sparred with verses. There was no official curriculum, no authority dictating topics. The Cafés was radically open. Any man with a sharp tongue or a clever idea could command attention. In this sense, it was a democratizing space, an arena where wit and eloquence outweighed wealth or rank. One of the most important roles of the coffee house was the transmission of news. In an empire as vast as the Ottomans, rumors and reports were as valuable as gold. Letters traveled slowly. Proclamations were issued from the palace, but took time to reach distant quarters. The Cafés filled this gap. Messengers, sailors, and merchants brought stories from the provinces. Travelers described conditions in Damascus or Baghdad. Gossip about the Sultan's court spread quickly, often embroidered by storytellers. In the absence of newspapers, the coffee house was the press office of the Ottoman street, a space where information was debated, distorted, and digested. But coffee houses were not limited to business and news. They were also centers of entertainment. Storytellers, known as metas, performed tales ranging from epic romances to biting satire. With a cane and a handkerchief as their only props, metas shifted voices and characters, imitating villagers, viziers, or foreign merchants to roars of laughter. Their stories carried moral lessons, political critique, or sheer amusement. Shadow plays, especially the famous Karagaz and Hasavat, were performed in coffee houses, their puppets casting humorous silhouettes on linen screens. These plays often mocked the pretensions of officials or the hypocrisies of society, delivering critique disguised as comedy. Games were another staple. Chess and backgammon filled tables, their clattering pieces mixing with the hum of voices. These games were more than pastimes. They were metaphors for strategy, fate, and patience. A good game of tabla could last as long as a conversation, and often the two ran side by side. Dice rolled as debates about poetry, politics, or trade unfolded. Poetry itself was central. The Ottoman world was steeped in verse, and the Kavahain was both stage and audience. Amateur poets tested their lines, while professional ones found eager listeners. Verses circulated orally long before they were written down, with coffee houses acting as the bridges between street culture and literary salons. Poetry competitions sometimes arose spontaneously, with men challenging each other to craft rhymes on the spot, their words rising like steam from the cups before them. What made these houses of conversation both vibrant and dangerous was the freedom of speech they fostered. In an empire where the Sultan's authority was absolute, and criticism of rulers could bring severe punishment, the Kavahain offered a space of relative autonomy. Conversations were not formally recorded, patrons were not always censored, and opinions could flow more freely than in mosques or courts. It was here that discontent brewed as easily as coffee. Men complained about taxes, mocked the inefficiencies of officials, and debated imperial policies. For rulers, this was both useful, because it revealed the pulse of public opinion, and threatening, because it gave voice to potential dissent. The authorities soon recognized the double-edged nature of these houses. Chroniclers describe how sultans and viziers sent spies into coffee houses to eavesdrop on conversations, to measure the mood of the people, and to identify sedition before it grew too loud. Yet despite surveillance and occasional suppression, conversation never ceased. The Kavahain had become too integral to urban life, too cherished as a space of fellowship and expression. Foreign visitors were quick to notice this atmosphere. One European traveler remarked that in the coffee houses of Istanbul, men learn more from each other's lips than from books. Another described them as universities of the street, where politics, religion, poetry, and trade were debated with equal passion. To outsiders, they appeared exotic, but also strangely familiar. Spaces of civic life, reminiscent of the forums of Rome or the agoras of Greece, reborn in Ottoman form. The Kavahain also served as bridges between communities. In multi-ethnic cities like Istanbul, Aleppo, and Sarajevo, Muslims, Christians, and Jews sometimes shared the same space, bound by the common ritual of the cup. While religious and political boundaries were sharp elsewhere, the coffee house blurred them, if only temporarily. In the house of conversation, identity was shaped less by creed than by the ability to join the flow of talk. The danger of these spaces lay precisely in their openness. Conversation is unpredictable, and satire has teeth. What began as gossip could turn into critique, and critique into conspiracy. The Ottoman authorities, ever wary of unrest, viewed the Kavahain as incubators of sedition. Bans would come, as later chapters will recount, but bans could never erase the memory of voices gathered in smoky rooms, cups in hand, imagining alternatives to the order outside. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the Kavahain had become an institution woven into the daily life of the empire. It was no longer a novelty, but a necessity, as essential to the rhythm of the city as the call to prayer or the bustle of the bazaar. In its benches and corners, conversations unfolded that shaped the opinions of merchants, the attitudes of janissaries, and the imaginations of poets. It was here, more than in the palace or mosque, that the Ottoman public sphere took form. To call them houses of conversation is to recognize their essence. They were not merely places to drink coffee, but places where words mattered, where news became knowledge, where gossip became satire, where speech itself became a form of power. The Ottomans brewed more than coffee in their sezves, they brewed society itself. Within the walls of the Ottoman coffee house, words flowed like rivers, but they were not the only currency of sociability. Alongside conversation, another rhythm filled the smoky air, the clatter of dice on wood, the scraping of chess pieces across boards, the laughter and groans of men absorbed in games of mind and chance. These diversions, simple at first glance, were more than idle pastimes. They reflected the intellectual culture of the empire, the philosophy of fate and fortune, and the communal spirit of the Cafés. To play in the coffee house was to participate in a tradition as social as it was symbolic, an enactment of chance and choice that mirrored the complexities of life itself. The most beloved of these games was tavla, known elsewhere as backgammon. Its roots stretched deep into Persian antiquity, but in Ottoman Istanbul, it found new life on the low tables of coffee houses. The board, with its 24 points and 30 checkers, became as familiar a sight as the sezv steaming on the brazier. Dice rolled across the polished surface, sometimes landing softly, sometimes with sharp clacks that drew glances from other patrons. Tavla was not just a game of chance, it was a test of strategy and patience. Players weighed each move with care, deciding whether to advance boldly or retreat defensively, always negotiating the interplay between luck and skill. In this, Tavla mirrored the Ottoman worldview. Fate was powerful, but human choice could shape outcomes. Equally prominent was chess, a game of deep strategy and intellectual prestige. Originating in India and refined in Persia, chess had long been favored by scholars and courtiers, but in the Cafés it became accessible to ordinary men. A carpenter could challenge a scholar, a janissary could match wits with a poet. The game's symbolism resonated with Ottoman society. The pieces, king, queen, or vizier in Islamic tradition, rooks, knights, bishops, and pawns, echoed the hierarchy of the empire. To play was not only to think, but to enact the logic of power. Pawns sacrificed, knights leaping unpredictably, the vizier supporting the king. Victories were celebrated, defeats accepted with grace or masked with excuses, but always the game demanded respect. Dice games also held sway. Simple throws of chance filled idle minutes, accompanied by laughter and banter. These games lacked the strategy of tavla or chess, but carried their own allure. For men who lived with uncertainty, in trade, in war, in life, the roll of dice was a reminder that fortune ruled much of existence. Some clerics frowned on such games, deeming them dangerously close to gambling. But in the coffee house they persisted, tolerated as part of the culture of risk and reward. Beyond formal games, the Cafés pulsed with storytelling, itself a kind of intellectual play. The metas, professional storytellers, wielded their cane and handkerchief to create entire worlds. They shifted voices, accents, and gestures to mimic villagers, viziers, or foreigners, weaving tales that could last hours. These performances were games of imagination, contests between storyteller and audience. If the meta could hold attention, he triumphed. If the audience grew restless, he failed. The Cafés rewarded wit, timing, and improvisation, turning stories into contests of creativity. Shadow plays, particularly the famous Karagöz and Hasavat, added another dimension of play. With simple puppets projected against a linen screen, performers conjured satire and comedy. Karagöz, the coarse commoner, clashed with Hasavat, the educated gentleman, in endless banter. Their antics mocked authority, ridiculed hypocrisy, and reflected the struggles of ordinary men. These plays were both entertainment and critique, laughter masking dissent. Like chess or tabla, they turned performance into a contest of wit, of subversion, of interpretation. The games of the Cafés carried deeper meanings. Tavla taught patience and resilience in the face of bad rolls. Chess demanded foresight and discipline. Dice acknowledged the role of fortune. Storytelling celebrated wit, and shadow plays revealed truth through humor. Together, they reflected the Ottoman view that life was a blend of destiny and choice, intellect and chance, order and chaos. To play was not to escape life, but to rehearse it, to grapple with its uncertainties in miniature. These games also reinforced the social fabric. A shared game created bonds, easing tensions between men of different ranks or backgrounds. A merchant might learn humility in losing to a janissary. A scholar might gain respect for a carpenter's sharp mind. Tavla boards and chess sets became tools of equality, leveling status in the same way as the ritual of the cup. Disputes over rules or moves were resolved with humor, the community enforcing civility. In this way, the Kavahane trained its patrons not only in play but in the art of coexistence. Foreign travelers often marvel at this culture of games. Europeans accustomed to taverns filled with drinking and rough brawls found Ottoman coffee houses surprisingly orderly, even intellectual. To them, the sight of men debating poetry over chess or laughing over tabla seemed exotic and refined. In their accounts, the Kavahane appeared as both strange and admirable, a place where the pleasures of the mind mingled with the stimulations of the cup. Yet authorities once again saw danger. Games could distract men from labor, could foster idleness, could bring soldiers and merchants together in unregulated gatherings. More troublingly, satire in stories or shadow plays could veil criticism of rulers. A meta-mocking a vizier was no less subversive than a tavla game that turned into a discussion of taxes or politics. The authorities knew that games were never just games. They were doorways to talk, and talk was power. Despite suspicions, the games endured, for they were as integral to the Kavahane as the Sezv itself. They filled the hours, sharpened minds, built friendships, and reflected life's paradoxes. In a world where labor was hard, hierarchies rigid, and politics often dangerous, the games of the Kavahane offered respite and rehearsal alike, a safe space to play with chance, wit, and power. By the end of the 16th century, tavla boards, chess sets, and puppet screens were as common in Istanbul's coffee houses as the cups of steaming brew. Together, they made the Kavahane not only a house of conversation but also a house of games, where the empire's men rehearsed the dramas of life in miniature, laughing, strategizing, and gambling with fate. As the Kavahane matured into a cornerstone of Ottoman urban life, its role extended far beyond coffee and games. These were not merely places of leisure. They were cultural stages, alive with words and performance. Within their smoky interiors, poetry was recited, sermons delivered, and plays enacted. The Kavahane became both salon and theater, mosque and marketplace, a place where art, religion, and entertainment mingled in a heady blend. To step inside was to enter not only a house of conversation, as we have seen, but a house of voices, where poets, preachers, and performers shaped the imagination of the empire. Poets and versifiers. Poetry held a revered place in Ottoman culture. From the ornate verses of court poets to the folk songs of wandering bards, poetry was both art and communication. In the coffee house, it found an eager audience. Amateur poets declaimed their lines, sometimes clumsy, sometimes brilliant. Patrons judged, applauded, or mocked, shaping reputations in the process. Verses could be devotional, romantic, or satirical. Love poetry circulated alongside biting critiques of hypocrisy or injustice. At times, impromptu competitions arose, with men challenging each other to compose rhymes on the spot, their wit as sharp as the bitter coffee in their cups. Professional poets also frequented the Kavahane, using the space as both stage and workshop. In the courtly salons of Topkapi, poetry was bound by etiquette and patronage. In the coffee house, it was freer, more spontaneous. Here, verses might mock officials or celebrate street life. Poetry, like coffee, was democratized, no longer confined to elite circles, but circulating through the very arteries of the city. It was said that in Istanbul, one could measure the vitality of a neighborhood by the quality of the verses exchanged in its coffee houses. Preachers and moralists. Not all voices in the Kavahane were playful. Religious preachers, some orthodox, others heterodox, found in these spaces an audience eager for meaning. They delivered sermons that blurred the line between entertainment and devotion, weaving moral lessons into stories. Some warned against idleness, against gambling, against the very coffee in men's cups. Others embraced the drink, linking its stimulating qualities to spiritual wakefulness. Sufi sheiks, in particular, saw the Cafés as an extension of their lodges, a place where remembrance of God could mingle with sociability. But preaching in the coffee house was not without risk. The authorities often saw unsanctioned sermons as dangerous, especially when they turned to politics. A preacher criticizing corruption or injustice could ignite dissent more effectively than a meta mocking a vizier. The line between religious exhortation and political critique was thin, and in the Cafés it was often crossed. For this reason, spies listened not only to gossip but to sermons, recording words that might undermine the Sultan's authority. Performers and storytellers. The most beloved figures in the coffee house were the performers, the metas, storytellers who could command an audience with little more than a cane and a handkerchief. These masters of oral art recited tales ranging from classical epics to everyday farce. They shifted voices, accents, and gestures with skill, transforming themselves into viziers, peasants, merchants, or foreigners. Their stories could stretch for hours, punctuated by coffee refills and bursts of laughter. The meta's art was more than entertainment. It preserved history, transmitted values, and delivered satire. Through humor and allegory, metas critiqued hypocrisy, injustice, or incompetence. Their stories might praise bravery or lampoon greed. In this way, they were both artists and social commentators, reflecting the world back to their audiences in exaggerated but revealing form. Even more theatrical were the shadow plays, especially the famous Karagöz and Hasavat. With simple puppets cut from leather and projected against a linen screen, performers created dramas that were at once comic and critical. Karagöz, the coarse but clever commoner, clashed with Hasavat, the polished but pompous gentleman. Their banter, full of double entendres and satire, mocked the powerful, celebrated the wit of the common man, and exposed the absurdities of society. These plays drew huge crowds, and many Cafés became known for their puppet shows, which could last deep into the night. A cultural crossroads. Together, poets, preachers, and performers turned the Cafés into a cultural crossroads. It was not an elite salon, not a formal mosque, not a state-sanctioned theater, yet it borrowed from all three. The Cafés was a place where the high and the low, the sacred and the profane, mingled freely. A verse from a divan poet might be followed by a Sufi parable, which in turn gave way to a bawdy joke from a shadow puppet. This fluidity reflected the richness of Ottoman society itself, diverse and layered, always negotiating between tradition and innovation. It also explained why the authorities regarded these spaces with suspicion. Poetry could inflame passion, sermons could spark dissent, performances could ridicule power. The Cafés gave ordinary men a stage, and on that stage, words became weapons as well as pleasures. To ban the Cafés, as some sultans attempted, was to silence not only gossip but culture itself. Yet bans never lasted. The people craved their poets, their preachers, their performers, and the Cafés was the only place where all could be found under one roof. Foreign eyes, travelers from Europe were fascinated. To them, the coffee house appeared as a theater of the people. They described storytellers captivating audiences, puppet plays ridiculing viziers, and poets sparking applause with clever rhymes. For Europeans used to theaters or salons reserved for the wealthy, the Ottoman Cafés seemed strangely egalitarian, a place where common men could enjoy art and performance. Some were scandalized by the frankness of satire, others enchanted by its vitality. Their reports carried the culture of the Ottoman coffee house back to Europe, where it mingled with emerging café traditions in Venice, Paris, and London. A living pulse. By the 17th century, the Cafés had fully become a cultural stage. To drink coffee, there was to join an audience, to become part of a collective experience. Each night was a performance, whether of verses recited, sermons preached, or plays enacted. The Cafés was alive, pulsing with voices, laughter, arguments, and applause. Its walls absorbed not only the scent of coffee but the sound of a society speaking, reflecting, and imagining itself anew. The role of poets, preachers, and performers in the coffee house cannot be overstated. They transformed it from a place of drinking into a place of meaning. They gave it soul, making the Cafés not just a house of coffee, but a house of culture. And in that culture lay both beauty and danger, for words inspire as well as provoke, delight as well as disturb. In the Ottoman world, as in all societies, the spoken word was power, and in the Kavahain, power was poured into every cup. By the time the Kavahain had become a fixture of Ottoman urban life in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, it was already more than a place of refreshment. Within its smoky walls, amid the clink of fincans and the murmur of conversations, another aroma began to drift, an aroma not of cardamom or roasted beans, but of unease. To the sultans and their viziers, the coffee house carried the fragrance of sedition. It was not the bitter liquid itself that unsettled them, but the words it enabled, the communities it fostered, the thoughts it incubated. In these small, crowded rooms, rulers smelled not only coffee but potential rebellion. The Ottoman Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries was immense, stretching from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the Balkans to North Africa. Governing such diversity required a delicate balance of power, loyalty, and perception. The Sultan was the shadow of God on earth, the Caliph of Islam, but even divine authority needed earthly support. Armies had to be fed and paid, taxes collected, religious legitimacy sustained. Yet the larger an empire grows, the more fragile its cohesion becomes. Discontent smolders in provinces, soldiers grumble about wages, bureaucrats resent corruption, merchants bristle at taxes. In the Kavahain, these embers could flare into flame. The authorities feared coffee houses for three reasons. The first was their gathering power. A Kavahain could attract dozens of men at a time, from janissaries to artisans, from scholars to merchants. Rarely elsewhere did such a cross-section of society mix so freely. In mosques, hierarchy prevailed. In the palace, access was limited. In markets, business ruled. But in the coffee house, men lingered without formal obligation, speaking as equals over shared cups. That gathering itself was a threat, for any group large enough to converse was large enough to conspire. The second reason was the freedom of speech that coffee houses allowed. In an empire where official proclamations flowed downward from the Sultan and dissent could be punished severely, the Kavahain provided a space for bottom-up conversation. Gossip about the court, satire of officials, debate over taxes or wars, all circulated in these smoky interiors. A meta story might lampoon a vizier, a puppet play might mock a policy, a conversation over tavla might turn to grumbling about soldiers' pay. Authorities understood that words, once spoken, could not be contained. The fragrance of sedition was the fragrance of unregulated talk. The third reason was the political potential of leisure. Coffee houses drew large numbers of janissaries, the elite core of soldiers who were both the backbone of Ottoman power and a frequent source of unrest. When janissaries gathered in barracks, they were disciplined. When they gathered in coffee houses, they were unpredictable. Here, far from the eyes of commanders, they could complain, plot, and stir trouble. Viziers dreaded the thought of discontented janissaries, their hands on cups one day and on sword hilts the next. It was no surprise, then, that Ottoman rulers periodically moved to suppress the Kavahain. In 1583, under Sultan Murad III, an edict closed many coffee houses, citing their idleness and their danger. The prohibition was framed in moral language. Coffee distracted men from work and prayer, but the underlying motive was political. When Sultan Murad IV came to power in the early 17th century, he took suppression to brutal extremes. Murad IV, remembered for his iron will and violent temper, not only banned coffee, but personally patrolled the streets of Istanbul in disguise, executing those caught drinking it. His reign remains infamous for the harshness of these bans. And yet, even under threat of death, the Kavahain survived. Men brewed coffee in secret, gathered quietly in hidden corners, or bribed officials to look the other way. The bans could not erase the desire for companionship, for conversation, for the ritual of the cup. In fact, repression may have only deepened the association of coffee houses with resistance. To drink together became an act of defiance. To gather in a Kavahain was to assert the right to speak, to imagine, to belong. Foreign observers noted this tension. European travelers wrote with fascination about the cycle of bans and reopenings. marveling that an empire so strong could be so troubled by a simple beverage. To them, it was evidence of the Ottoman rulers' recognition of the true power of the coffee house. They understood, as did the sultans themselves, that it was not the drink but the discourse that mattered. The authorities tried various strategies to contain this power. Spies were dispatched to sit quietly among the patrons, listening for dangerous talk. Some coffee houses were co-opted by officials, encouraged to foster loyalty rather than dissent. Others were tolerated in certain neighborhoods, but forbidden in others. But the Kavahain was too widespread, too beloved, to be controlled entirely. Like the smoke of its braziers, it seeped into every crevice of the city. The fragrance of sedition lingered because the Kavahain gave ordinary men a sense of agency. Here, a porter or artisan could hear the latest news, debate its meaning, and form an opinion. He might never speak directly to a vizier, but he could voice his frustrations in a coffee house. In time, these frustrations accumulated, shaping the mood of the city. Authorities could silence individuals, but not the collective murmur of hundreds of Kavahains across Istanbul. By the 17th century, the coffee house was firmly established as both cultural hub and political threat. Every steaming cup carried with it not only the aroma of roasted beans, but the possibility of rebellion. Poets mocked the powerful, preachers stirred the faithful, storytellers slipped satire into their tales, janissaries complained about pay, merchants debated taxes. The Kavahain was the empire's pressure valve, releasing grievances in smoke and words. But like any valve, it could burst if pressed too hard. The Ottomans would continue to wrestle with the coffee house for centuries, alternating between toleration and prohibition, suspicion and celebration. But the truth remained. Once men had tasted the pleasures of conversation over coffee, they would not relinquish them. The Kavahain could be banned, spied upon, or condemned, but it could not be forgotten. It carried the fragrance of sedition because it carried the fragrance of freedom, however fragile, however fleeting. The Ottomans were not the first to fear coffee, nor the first to attempt to ban it, but within their empire the struggle between cup and crown reached dramatic intensity. From the moment Kavahains became popular in Istanbul, sultans and viziers issued edicts and prohibitions, trying again and again to control, suppress, or eliminate the spaces where men gathered over steaming cups. These bans reveal as much about the anxieties of rulers as they do about the passions of the people. For in each prohibition, we glimpse a state wrestling with a force too deeply woven into daily life to be destroyed. The first bans appeared outside Istanbul. In Mecca in 1511, local jurists declared coffee unlawful, claiming it intoxicated and encouraged disorder. Coffee houses were shuttered, beans burned. Yet the ban did not last. The drink had already taken root among scholars, merchants, and pilgrims, and higher authorities eventually overturned the decision. This pattern, fear, prohibition, resistance, repeal, would repeat itself in the Ottoman capital for centuries. By the mid-16th century, as Kavahains multiplied in Istanbul, suspicion deepened. In 1583, under Sultan Murad III, the state issued its first major prohibition. Coffee houses were closed on grounds of idleness and immorality. Chroniclers record that officials feared not only wasted hours, but dangerous talk. To linger in conversation was to risk conspiracy. The ban was enforced unevenly. Some houses shut their doors, others operated quietly. But the message was clear. The state saw coffee as more than a drink. It saw it as a threat. Yet the bans rarely stuck. Coffee houses reopened, sometimes with tacit approval, sometimes in open defiance. The people's appetite for coffee and conversation was too strong. By the early 17th century, Kavahains flourished once again, prompting harsher measures under Sultan Murad IV, 1623 to 1640. Murad IV, remembered for his ferocity, is said to have banned coffee, tobacco, and alcohol with equal severity. Contemporary accounts claim he patrolled the streets of Istanbul in disguise, striking down violators with his own sword. Whether embellished or not, the image of the Sultan stalking coffee drinkers captures the climate of fear. For Murad, coffee was not only immoral but subversive, a catalyst for gatherings he could not control. Even after Murad's death, suspicion lingered. Successive rulers issued edicts, closing houses, fining patrons, confiscating equipment. At times the bans were linked to military unrest. The janissaries, frequent patrons of Cafés, used them as spaces to grumble about pay or plot mutiny. In times of tension, officials saw closing coffee houses as a way to defuse sedition. At other times, the bans were framed as moral reform, echoing the arguments of conservative scholars who decried coffee as a distraction from prayer. But enforcement was always inconsistent. Istanbul was a vast and complex city, and the Cafés was too popular to eradicate. In wealthy neighborhoods, coffee houses reopened with subtle patronage from officials themselves. In poorer quarters, they continued behind shuttered doors, bribing guards or operating as private houses. Even during the harshest bans, coffee was never absent. It merely went underground. These cycles of prohibition and persistence shaped the identity of the Cafés itself. To drink coffee in defiance of a ban was to perform resistance. To gather in a shuttered house was to assert community. The very act of maintaining the ritual of the cup under threat of punishment turned coffee houses into symbols of autonomy. They were no longer just places of leisure. They were emblems of the people's refusal to be silenced. It is telling that bans often failed not only because of public resistance, but because of elite hypocrisy. Viziers and high officials, while condemning coffee houses publicly, were known to enjoy coffee in their private residences. Even in the palace, coffee service had become part of courtly ritual by the 17th century. The Sultan's harem developed its own ranks of coffee makers, Cafés, who prepared the drink for the women of the court. Coffee was too entrenched in elite culture to be uprooted, creating a contradiction between official prohibitions and private indulgence. European travelers were fascinated by this struggle. They recorded stories of bans and punishments, often exaggerating their brutality for dramatic effect. To European readers, the idea that an emperor might fear coffee seemed both exotic and absurd. Yet these accounts also spread coffee's mystique, fueling its eventual adoption in Venice, London, and Paris. Ironically, Ottoman prohibitions may have helped popularize the drink abroad, even as they tried to suppress it at home. Over time, the bans became less frequent, though never entirely absent. By the late 17th century, Ottoman rulers recognized that coffee houses could not be eliminated. Instead, they sought to regulate them, sending spies, licensing proprietors, and occasionally cracking down during periods of unrest. The Cafés had survived prohibition by becoming indispensable. The history of edicts and prohibitions reveals a deeper truth about power. Rulers feared the coffee house not because of what was in the cup, but because of what emerged around it: conversation, community, critique. The very act of gathering carried political weight, and the state's attempt to suppress it only heightened its significance. In every ban, the Cafés emerged stronger, its identity sharpened as a space of resistance as well as leisure. Thus, the cycle of prohibition became part of the coffee house's mythology. To sit in a Café, even in times of tolerance, was to recall its history of danger and defiance. The scent of coffee was mingled forever with the memory of repression. The Ottomans may have tried to silence the Cafés, but in doing so they confirmed its power. For every edict, there was resistance. For every closure, a reopening. For every prohibition, a defiance. The Cafés endured because it was more than a house of coffee. It was a house of community. And no edict, however harsh, could erase the human need to gather, to talk, to share. In the clash between bean and empire, it was the bean that prevailed, carried in the cups of men who refused to surrender their voices. For every edict that closed the doors of the Cafés, another hand found a way to reopen them. For every sultan who declared coffee unlawful, there were thousands of men unwilling to surrender their cup. The Ottoman story of coffee houses is not only one of prohibitions handed down from above, but also of resistances that welled up from below. Against the heavy hand of imperial power, the people responded with ingenuity, persistence, and quiet defiance. The Cafés survived not because it was tolerated, but because it was demanded, woven into the daily life of Istanbul and beyond. The earliest bans, such as those under Sultan Murad III in the late 16th century, were met with evasions as subtle as they were effective. Coffee drinkers shifted to private homes, disguising gatherings as family visits or religious meetings. Merchants set up makeshift stalls in back alleys, serving the brew in earthen cups behind curtains. Patrons learned to drink quickly, dispersing at the first sign of patrols. Coffee houses became mobile and secretive, their life carried in says tucked under cloaks and in whispered invitations passed among friends. During the harsh reign of Murad IV, when punishments for coffee drinking could be severe, resistance grew even more creative. Chroniclers tell of men digging small pits in the ground, building hidden braziers to roast beans unseen. Some disguised coffee houses as barber shops or bathhouse antechambers, offering cups discreetly behind the facade of legitimate business. Others bribed local officials or janissary officers to turn a blind eye. In poorer neighborhoods, entire communities protected their kavahain, warning each other of patrols, shielding proprietors from inspection, and scattering dice and chessboards at the first knock on the door. The janissaries, who were both enforcers of order and frequent patrons themselves, played a double role in this resistance. Officially bound to uphold the bans, many janissaries defied them in practice, drinking and playing tavla in uniform. Some commanders even used kavahains to maintain ties with their men, tacitly accepting their existence. In this way, the very soldiers tasked with enforcing prohibitions became allies of resistance, ensuring that bans could never be fully imposed. The resilience of the kavahain was also fueled by its deep embedding in everyday life. Coffee was no longer a novelty, but a necessity. For merchants, it was a pause between negotiations. For artisans, a respite from labor. For scholars, a companion to study. For poets, an inspiration. The kavahain was not simply a place of leisure, but a space where community itself was enacted. To eliminate it was to strip neighborhoods of their center, to deny men their daily rhythm. The people resisted not only out of defiance, but out of need. Satire, too, became a weapon of resistance. Metas and shadow puppeteers mocked the bans openly, turning sultans' edicts into subjects of laughter. Karagaz, the crude commoner of the shadow stage, was often depicted sneaking coffee past bumbling officials, ridiculing both the prohibition and the men who tried to enforce it. Such performances turned repression into comedy, undermining the state's authority with humor sharper than swords. In every joke, resistance was reinforced, the absurdity of prohibition laid bare. Foreign travelers recorded these contradictions with fascination. They described walking through Istanbul and finding coffee houses closed by order, yet bustling with hidden patrons. They marveled at the ingenuity of Turks who sipped coffee behind shutters, the smoke drifting into the streets as silent testimony. To European eyes, the persistence of coffee drinkers revealed both the futility of prohibition and the passion of the Ottoman people for their brew. Over time, resistance reshaped the meaning of the kavahain itself. To sit in one was no longer merely to enjoy leisure. It was to participate in a subtle act of defiance. A cup of coffee became a symbol of autonomy, a quiet rebellion against authority. Patrons knew the risks, yet they gathered anyway, affirming with every sip that community and conversation could not be extinguished. The kavahain was not just a house of coffee, it was a house of resistance. This popular defiance eventually forced rulers to compromise. By the late 17th century, bans became rarer and less harsh, not because the state ceased to fear the kavahain, but because it recognized the impossibility of eradicating it. Instead, the empire turned to regulation, licensing some establishments, taxing others, and sending spies to monitor conversations. The people's resistance had secured survival, if not full acceptance. The endurance of the kavahain underscores a broader truth about Ottoman society. Authority was powerful, but it was never absolute. Even in a sultanate that claimed divine legitimacy, the will of the people mattered. The empire could command soldiers, levy taxes, and ban substances, but it could not strip men of their desire to gather, to talk, to laugh, to share. Against the machinery of empire, the simple act of brewing coffee proved unassailable. The people resisted not with armies but with says, not with banners but with benches, not with rebellion but with ritual. And in so doing, they preserved the kavahain through centuries of suspicion and suppression. The smoke rising from hidden braziers, the foam on secret cups, the laughter muffled behind shutters. All were forms of defiance. They were proof that no empire, however mighty, could fully silence the ordinary rhythms of its people. Thus, the Kavahane became both a cultural treasure and a political symbol. It endured because the people demanded it, resisted for it, and reimagined it in the face of prohibition. In the Ottoman world, as in so many others, resistance was not always loud or violent. Sometimes, it was as quiet as a sip of coffee taken in defiance of a ban. Sometimes, it was as simple as a game of tavla played behind closed doors. And sometimes, it was as powerful as laughter at a puppet play that mocked the state itself. The people resisted, and because they did, the Kavahane survived. It would continue to shape Ottoman society, influencing politics, religion, culture, and even the empire's relations with Europe. But at its heart, it remained what it had always been: a house of coffee, conversation, and community, protected not by decrees but by the persistence of those who refused to let it die. If the palace feared the Kavahane for its politics, the mosque regarded it with ambivalence for its spirituality. Coffee, after all, entered Ottoman lands first through the devotions of Sufi mystics, who drank it to remain wakeful during long nights of zikr, their remembrance of God. In its earliest chapters, the bean was sanctified, its bitterness sweetened by prayer. Yet once it left the zawiyas of Yemen and the lodges of dervishes to fill the bustling houses of Istanbul, it began to carry a new reputation. For some religious authorities, the Kavahane was a rival, an alternative congregation where men gathered not for worship but for play, where sermons of metas replaced khutbahs, and where the aroma of coffee seemed to draw men away from the minbar. Thus, the relationship between coffee and the mosque was uneasy, marked by both sanctification and suspicion. Coffee as spiritual aid. Sufi orders had long embraced coffee as a tool of devotion. In Yemen and later in Cairo and Damascus, dervishes drank it in ceremonies to sustain their vigils. For them, the cup was not frivolity but discipline. It sharpened concentration, warded off fatigue, and enabled the heart to remain open through hours of chanting. Many Sufi sheikhs defended coffee on theological grounds. Unlike wine, it clouded no mind, dulled no senses. On the contrary, it heightened awareness. To them, coffee was lawful, halal, even blessed. They spread this conviction through their lodges, ensuring that when the bean reached Istanbul, it already carried the aura of sacred legitimacy. Clerical anxiety. Yet among the more conservative ulama, the scholars of Islamic law, coffee was cause for concern. They questioned whether its stimulating properties made it akin to intoxicants, which the Quran forbade. They pointed to its social effects: long hours spent in idle talk, frivolous games, gossip that strayed into slander. If the mosque called men to prayer, the coffee house tempted them into distraction. In their eyes, the Kavahane was a rival congregation, one that did not lead men to God but to worldliness. Preachers thundered against it, calling it a house of sin, a den of idlers. Some fatwas declared coffee itself unlawful, not only the houses in which it was served. This anxiety was not purely theological. The mosque was a central organ of social life, its sermons shaping public opinion, its courtyards serving as gathering spaces. The rise of the Kavahane threatened this authority. Where once men lingered after prayer to discuss affairs, they now wandered to coffee houses, where the imam's words could be drowned out by satire or gossip. The mosque and the Kavahane were not enemies, but they were competitors for the soul of the community. The ambiguous role of preachers. Ironically, some of the very men who condemned the Kavahane also frequented it. Preachers found in coffee houses eager audiences, and some used the venue to spread their messages. They delivered sermons between cups, urging patrons to remember God even as they enjoyed the bitter drink. These sermons blurred the lines between mosque and Kavahane, sanctifying the space while also acknowledging its dangers. A preacher railing against coffee in one setting might accept a fincan in another. This ambiguity reflected the complexity of Ottoman religiosity, where piety and sociability often mingled. Coffee as moral mirror. The debates over coffee revealed deeper concerns about morality and order. Coffee itself was not intoxicating, but it fostered gatherings where men might gamble, mock authority, or neglect prayer. The ulama feared not the bean but the community it created, a fellowship beyond clerical control. To them, the Kavahain symbolized a shift in authority, from mosque to marketplace, from pulpit to puppet stage, from sermon to satire. Every steaming sezv seemed to challenge the monopoly of the minbar, religious endorsement and resistance. Yet not all religious voices condemned. Some ulama argued that coffee was no different from tea or other stimulants, that it was neutral in itself and only sinful if misused. They noted its utility in scholarship, enabling students to study late into the night. Sufi orders defended it vigorously, citing its role in sustaining devotion. Over time, this defense gained ground, especially as bans proved futile and the drink entrenched itself in Ottoman culture. By the 18th century, many scholars accepted coffee as lawful, though they continued to warn against the excesses of the Kavahain, a space between sacred and secular. The uneasy relationship between coffee and the mosque highlights a larger transformation in Ottoman society, the emergence of spaces that were neither fully sacred nor purely profane. The Kavahain occupied this middle ground. It borrowed rituals from religion. Its serving was ceremonial, its gatherings communal, yet it also subverted them. It created a fellowship outside the structures of mosque and state, one bound not by faith or law but by conversation and caffeine. This tension is visible in anecdotes preserved by chroniclers. Some men, it is said, would leave Friday prayer only to stream into coffee houses, carrying the words of the imam into the smoke-filled rooms, debating them, mocking them, or weaving them into games of tavla. Others skipped prayer altogether, lingering in the Kavahain while the call to prayer echoed outside. The mosque summoned with divine authority, the Kavahain enticed with human fellowship. Between the two, men often chose both, but sometimes they chose the cup over the call. Endurance despite opposition. Despite clerical opposition, coffee triumphed. The mosque remained central, but it did not eclipse the Kavahain. Instead, the two coexisted uneasily, sometimes complementing each other, sometimes competing. Coffee was served in homes after prayers, linking devotion with hospitality. Imams themselves were known to drink it, blurring lines between condemnation and indulgence. Over time, the sharpness of the debate softened, as coffee became too embedded in daily life to uproot. A reflection of change. The conflict between mosque and Kavahain was ultimately a reflection of broader change. Ottoman society was shifting, urbanizing, diversifying. Authority, once centered on mosque and state, now had to contend with new public spheres. The Kavahain was one such sphere, embodying a new form of community, one that could honor tradition while also challenging it. Its survival against clerical critique demonstrated the adaptability of Ottoman society, its ability to incorporate novelty even amid resistance. Thus, the relationship between coffee and the mosque was not one of simple opposition but of tension and negotiation. The Kavahain did not replace the mosque, but it redefined the landscape of sociability. It created a new congregation, one that worshipped not in prayer but in conversation, not in scripture but in story. And though some ulama condemned it as distraction, others embraced it as tool, and the people, caught between, simply continued to drink. In the end, coffee did not weaken faith, but it did alter the fabric of society. It created spaces where authority could be questioned, where sermons could be debated, where fellowship could exist outside formal structures. The mosque called men to God. The Kavahain called them to each other. And in the Ottoman world, both calls were irresistible. As coffee houses multiplied across the Ottoman Empire, their fame spilled far beyond the walls of Istanbul and Aleppo, Damascus and Cairo. Merchants, travelers, and diplomats, those who crossed the empire's vast roads and waterways, became witnesses to the Kavahain, carrying its image outward, interpreting it for foreign audiences, and in so doing, spreading the very culture that Ottoman rulers alternately tolerated and feared. Through their eyes, coffee houses became emblems of Ottoman society, exotic, unsettling, alluring. And through their journeys, the bean itself traveled, making its way from Mocha and Istanbul to Venice, Paris, London, and beyond. Merchants and the trade in beans. The foundation of this story was commerce. Coffee was cultivated in Yemen, particularly in the highlands surrounding Mocha, where the soil and climate gave the beans a distinctive flavor. Ottoman control of the Red Sea and Arabian ports allowed them to dominate this trade for centuries. Ships carried sacks of beans northward to Suez, where caravans transported them across the desert to Cairo. From there, coffee spread along caravan routes to Aleppo, Damascus, and Istanbul. The merchants who carried these beans did more than move goods. They spread customs. Wherever beans arrived, coffee houses followed, sprouting like vines along trade routes. Merchants from Europe soon took notice. Venetian traders were among the first to encounter coffee in Ottoman lands, bringing small quantities back to Italy in the late 16th century. They marveled at its stimulating effects and its ceremonial preparation, though at first they treated it as medicine rather than a drink of leisure. From Venice, knowledge of coffee spread slowly into other European ports. The Ottomans did not relinquish their monopoly easily, but smuggling and imitation would eventually undermine their hold. Still, for much of the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire remained the central supplier of the world's coffee, and the Kavahain its living advertisement. Travelers and the tales they told. European travelers wrote with fascination about the Kavahain. To them, these smoky rooms were strange yet captivating, filled with men sitting for hours, drinking a bitter, black liquid, playing games, listening to storytellers. Some described them with admiration. The French traveler Jean de Thevenot noted that coffee fortifies the stomach, helps digestion, and quickens the spirits. Others were suspicious. They saw the Kavahain as dens of idleness, where men wasted time in chatter. Yet even these criticisms carried fascination. Coffee was unlike anything in European experience. Travel accounts often emphasized the theatrical elements of the coffee house. The shadow plays of Karagaz and Hasavat, the recitations of metas, the clatter of tavla boards. They described the seriousness with which coffee was prepared and the rituals of serving it. They also noted the political undertones. Some observed that men in Kavahains debated imperial policies, criticized viziers, and spread gossip. To European readers, this sounded oddly familiar. In their own societies, taverns and inns carried similar reputations as places of descent. In this way, the Kavahain appeared both exotic and recognizable, foreign yet strangely relatable. Diplomats and the politics of coffee. Diplomats encountered coffee houses with more caution. Ambassadors sent to Istanbul from Venice, France, and England often reported on the popularity of coffee and the suspicions it aroused among Ottoman rulers. They noted the periodic bans, the reopening of houses, the role of janissaries as patrons. For diplomats, Kavahains were not only curiosities, but also sources of intelligence. News spread quickly within their walls, and ambassadors' agents sometimes frequented them to hear the pulse of the city. In this way, the Kavahain became a node in the empire's information network, not only for Ottomans, but for foreigners as well. Diplomats also played a role in transmitting coffee culture back to Europe. The famous ambassador Suleiman Aga, who represented the Ottoman court in Paris in 1669, introduced French elites to the drink, serving it with Ottoman ceremony. At first, Parisians regarded it with skepticism, mocking its bitterness. But within decades, coffee houses in Paris flourished, modeled consciously or unconsciously on Ottoman prototypes. What began in Yemen and blossomed in Istanbul became, by the late 17th century, a European fashion. The spread of café culture. Merchants, travelers, and diplomats together carried coffee from Ottoman domains into Europe. By the early 17th century, Venice had its first coffee house. By the mid-17th, London and Paris followed, each adapting the institution to local customs. The European café became a hub of commerce, politics, and intellectual exchange, mirroring the Kavahain, though with its own character. In London, coffee houses became known as penny universities, where men bought a cup and gained access to news, lectures, and debate. In Paris, they became fashionable salons of enlightenment. All owed their origins to the Ottoman Kavahain, the model seen and described by foreign visitors, perceptions, and misunderstandings. Yet these transfers were not without distortion. European writers often exoticized Ottoman coffee houses, portraying them as mysterious, sensual, or dangerous. They described shadow plays as strange spectacles, the bitter drink as almost medicinal, the atmosphere as both alluring and decadent. Some misunderstood the role of coffee in Ottoman society, assuming it to be universally accepted when in fact it was contested. Others exaggerated the severity of bans, painting Murad IV as a tyrant who killed coffee drinkers at random. These tales, whether accurate or embellished, heightened the allure of coffee in Europe, turning it into a symbol of the Orient's mystery. A global commodity is born. By the late 17th century, the Ottoman monopoly began to weaken. Europeans established their own coffee plantations in colonies from Java to the Caribbean, ensuring supply independent of Yemen. Yet the cultural image of the coffee house remained Ottoman. The Kavahain had shaped how coffee was imagined, as a drink of conversation, debate, and performance. Even as the bean became global, the Ottoman model lingered in every European café, every colonial plantation, every steaming cup poured in salons and studies. The merchants had carried the beans, the travelers had carried the stories, the diplomats had carried the rituals. Together, they transformed coffee from a local stimulant into a global commodity. But at the heart of this expansion was the Kavahain, whose reputation as a house of conversation and controversy made coffee more than a drink. It made it a culture. The spread of coffee reminds us that culture moves not only by armies and decrees, but by merchants' sacks, travelers' words, and diplomats' gestures. The Ottoman Kavahain became a seed planted far beyond its own empire, sprouting in cities that would never hear the call to prayer, but would echo with the clink of cups and the murmur of voices over coffee. The Ottoman Kavahain was never merely a place of leisure. It was a mirror held up to the empire itself. Within its smoky walls, the contradictions of Ottoman society played out in miniature. The splendor and strain of a vast, multi-ethnic polity, the coexistence and friction of different faiths, the mingling of soldiers and scholars, merchants and mendicants. To sit in a coffee house was to sit in the shadow of empire, where the daily dramas of ordinary men reflected the grandeur and fragility of one of the world's most powerful states. An empire of diversity. The Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents, encompassing Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Bosnians, Albanians, and countless others. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side, bound by the millet system that recognized communal autonomy under imperial oversight. This diversity spilled into the coffee houses. In Istanbul, Aleppo, or Sarajevo, one might find a Kavahain where Muslims and Christians shared a table, sipping from the same sezv. Jewish patrons frequented certain establishments, bringing their own traditions of storytelling and song. In frontier towns, Balkan villagers, Ottoman soldiers, and traveling merchants all mingled over coffee. These spaces were rare arenas where imperial diversity became tangible, where difference was mediated by a shared ritual of the cup. Social hierarchies in flux. Ottoman society was hierarchical, with sultans, viziers, ulama, and janissaries wielding power over artisans, peasants, and slaves. Yet in the Kavahain, these hierarchies could blur. A carpenter might challenge a scholar at chess. A porter might laugh at the satire of a meta. A janissary might debate politics with a merchant. The Kavahain did not erase social ranks, but it suspended them. It created a temporary equality, bound by the shared ritual of drinking coffee. This inversion unsettled the elite, for it gave common men a voice that might carry further than their station should allow. In the shadow of empire, the Kavahain was a place where the powerless rehearsed power, a forum of contradictions. The Kavahain reflected the contradictions of Ottoman governance. Officially, the empire prided itself on order, hierarchy, and obedience. Yet within coffee houses, disorderly talk, satire, and even sedition flourished. Official proclamations might ban gatherings, but Kavahains buzzed with gossip. The ulama might declare coffee unlawful, yet imams themselves were known to drink it. Viziers might condemn coffee houses as dens of idleness, yet secretly frequented them. The coffee house thus embodied the double life of the empire. Public orthodoxy paired with private indulgence, prohibitions announced but rarely enforced, a state both powerful and porous. The janissary's shadow. No presence loomed larger in the Kavahain than the janissaries. These elite soldiers, once disciplined guardians of the Sultan, had by the 17th century become deeply entangled in urban life. They owned shops, extorted protection money, and dominated neighborhoods. In the coffee house, they were not only patrons but power brokers. Their presence intimidated others, yet also lent protection. A Cavahane favored by janissaries might thrive, while one without their blessing risked closure. The janissary coffee houses became political hubs, where grievances about pay or leadership simmered. In this way, the Cavahane stood in the shadow of military power, a reminder that the empire's own soldiers could be both protectors and threats. Urban centers and provincial variations. In Istanbul, coffee houses were dens of debate, theater, and politics. In Aleppo, they became meeting places for caravans, where merchants exchanged information about distant markets. In Cairo, they echoed with music and song, blending African and Arab traditions. In Sarajevo and Belgrade, they served as communal centers, linking Ottoman culture with local customs. Each Cavahane reflected both the empire's common identity and its regional diversity. They were shadows not only of imperial power but of provincial adaptation, showing how the empire was both centralized and plural. Religious tensions. The Cavahane also stood in the shadow of religious contradiction. Sufis sanctified coffee, conservatives condemned it, yet both could be found in its smoky halls. Preachers might rail against idleness in the morning, then sip quietly from a fincan in the evening. Coffee houses hosted sermons as well as satire, zikr as well as gossip. They blurred the line between sacred and profane, challenging the monopoly of the mosque as the sole site of communal gathering. In this sense, they embodied the tension between tradition and innovation, between the stability of religion and the dynamism of urban culture. Spaces of empire, spaces of resistance. The Cavahane was also a place where empire's authority was tested. Taxes were debated, wars criticized, viziers mocked. Stories told in puppet plays or by metas carried subtle critiques of corruption or injustice. The Cavahane was not revolutionary in the modern sense, but it was a space where dissatisfaction could be expressed collectively. It was a shadow parliament, a place where men rehearsed grievances that, in time, could spill into the streets. The empire tolerated them because it could not do otherwise, yet it feared them for the same reason. Foreign eyes and imperial reflections. Foreign travelers saw in the Cavahane a microcosm of the Ottoman world. They marveled at its diversity, its civility, its vibrancy, but also noted its dangers. To them, it revealed both the strengths of Ottoman culture, its hospitality, its eloquence, its communal spirit, and its weaknesses, its idleness, its volatility, its simmering dissent. In their writings, the coffee house became a metaphor for the empire itself, grand, diverse, but vulnerable to the very forces that made it vital. The empire in a cup. Every cup of coffee in the Cavahane carried the shadow of empire. The beans came from Yemen, carried along imperial trade routes, taxed by imperial officials. The rituals of serving reflected Ottoman refinement. The conversations within reflected imperial tensions, diversity and hierarchy, authority and dissent, faith and skepticism. The Cavahane was thus not only a house of coffee but a house of empire, where the complexities of a vast polity were condensed into a single room. The Cavahane endured because it embodied the empire itself. It was contradictory yet cohesive, diverse yet unified, fragile yet resilient. It was a shadow in which the empire could see both its greatness and its flaws. To step into a coffee house was to step into the Ottoman world in miniature, to experience its pleasures and its perils, its order and its unrest. In this way, the Cavahane was both a reflection and a prophecy. It showed the empire as it was, diverse, dynamic, but tense. And it hinted at what the empire might become if its contradictions deepened, a place where talk turned to dissent, where the fragrance of coffee masked the fragrance of sedition, where the shadow of empire lengthened into the twilight of its decline. The Cavahane was not a singular institution confined to Istanbul. As the empire stretched its arms across 3 continents, so too did the coffee house spread, adapting to the rhythms, tastes, and traditions of the diverse provinces. From the bustling caravanserais of Aleppo to the stone courtyards of Sarajevo, the Kavahane took on regional flavors while retaining its essential character: a house of coffee, conversation, and community. To trace its spread is to see how a single being connected cities and peoples, weaving together the fabric of the Ottoman world. Aleppo, crossroads of commerce. Aleppo, one of the great trading centers of the empire, became an early and vital hub of coffee culture. Situated at the meeting point of caravan routes from Persia, Anatolia, and the Arabian Peninsula, Aleppo absorbed influences from across the empire. Its coffee houses reflected this cosmopolitan character. Merchants from as far as India or Venice might find themselves sipping coffee together, exchanging news of distant markets. Alpine Kavahanes were known for their grandeur, some housed in vaulted caravanserais where travelers could rest and trade while enjoying a cup. Storytellers thrived here, their tales seasoned with references to lands beyond the desert. To sit in an Aleppo Kavahane was to sit at the world's crossroads, with coffee as the common tongue. Damascus and Cairo, coffee with spirit. In Damascus, the Kavahane was infused with spirituality. The city, rich in Sufi lodges and religious traditions, saw coffee houses as extensions of its devotional culture. Poets recited mystical verses, preachers expounded on morality, and Sufis gathered in zikr after cups of steaming brew. Yet these houses were also worldly, alive with gossip and political talk. Cairo, by contrast, pulsed with vitality. Its coffee houses ranged from grand establishments near the Khan el-Khalili Bazaar to humble street stalls. Music was central here. Oud players and singers entertained patrons, turning Kavahanes into concert halls of the common people. In both Damascus and Cairo, the Kavahane blurred the lines between sacred and profane, entertainment and devotion, in ways unique to Arab lands. Anatolia, hearths of community. In Anatolian towns and villages, the Kavahane was simpler but no less central. Often little more than wooden rooms with benches and a brazier, these houses were the hearts of rural communities. Men gathered not for elaborate performances but for fellowship, sharing news of harvests, debating local disputes, playing tavla by lamplight. Here, the Kavahane served as a town hall, a courthouse, and a theater all at once. In winter, it was a hearth against the cold. In summer, a shaded refuge. The Ottoman state reached Anatolia through tax collectors and judges, but the community was bound together in the Kavahane. The Balkans, Sarajevo and beyond. In the Balkans, the Kavahane took root deeply, leaving a legacy that endures to this day. Sarajevo, the jewel of Bosnia, was dotted with coffee houses by the 17th century. Nestled along the Miljacka River, its Kavahanes became symbols of identity, places where Bosniaks embraced Ottoman culture while infusing it with local character. Coffee was served slowly, with rituals that emphasized patience and hospitality. Over time, this tradition evolved into Bosnian coffee culture, still alive centuries later, where the sezv and small copper cups remained central to daily life. Elsewhere in the Balkans, Skopje, Belgrade, Thessaloniki, the Kavahane spread as both social institution and cultural marker. In multi-ethnic towns, Muslims, Orthodox Christians, and Jews sat side by side, the cup bridging divides even when politics or religion pulled them apart. The Kavahane became one of the most visible legacies of Ottoman influence in the region, so much so that even after the empire retreated, the ritual of coffee endured. Today, to drink Turkish or Bosnian coffee is to taste a remnant of Ottoman sociability, carried forward across generations. Venice, Vienna, and the edge of empire. Even at the empire's borders, the Kavahane left its mark. Venetian traders carried stories of Ottoman coffee houses back to Italy, inspiring Europe's first cafés. Vienna, after the failed Ottoman siege of 1683, claimed to have captured sacks of beans from retreating soldiers, sparking its own coffee tradition. Whether legend or fact, this information has not been verified. The story reveals how closely the Kavahane was tied to perceptions of the empire. To Europeans, the coffee house was the emblem of Ottoman sociability, and to adopt it was to borrow both its allure and its aura of danger. Unity in diversity. What united these regional variations was the ritual of the cup. Whether in the vaulted halls of Aleppo, the musical streets of Cairo, the simple hearths of Anatolia, Or the riverside cafés of Sarajevo. Coffee was brewed in ses, served in small cups, and consumed slowly. The settings differed, the entertainments varied, but the essence was the same: coffee as a medium of community. The Cavahane's adaptability was its strength. It could be grand or humble, sacred or worldly, urban or rural. In every form, it answered the same need: the human desire to gather, to converse, to share. The shadow of authority. Yet, even in distant provinces, the Cavahane carried the same fragrance of suspicion. Local officials worried about gatherings that might spark unrest. Governors issued bans, especially in times of tension, echoing the edicts of Istanbul. But as in the capital, the people resisted. The Cavahane had become too beloved, too essential, to disappear. Its spread across the empire only deepened its resilience, ensuring that even when suppressed in one place, it thrived in another. Legacy across lands. By the 18th century, the Cavahane was not only an Ottoman institution but a global one. From Aleppo to Sarajevo, its presence marked the empire's reach, binding distant regions with a common ritual. Each region gave it flavor, yet all shared its essence. The Cavahane was both local and imperial, diverse and unified, provincial and cosmopolitan. In its spread, we see the Ottoman Empire not as a monolith, but as a mosaic, each tile reflecting the same pattern in its own hue. The Cavahane's journey across the empire ensured its survival beyond it. When Ottoman rule receded, coffee culture remained. In Sarajevo, in Cairo, in Aleppo, in Anatolian villages, the ritual endured, carried forward by memory and habit. The empire cast a long shadow, but the Cavahane became its most enduring light, an institution that outlived sultans and viziers, wars and decrees, embodying in every cup the resilience of community across geography and time. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Cavahane, once the epicenter of Ottoman sociability and dissent, began to face new pressures that would alter its role in society. It did not disappear. Indeed, it remained beloved, but it was transformed by modernization, the encroachment of European models, and the empire's own changing tastes. What had once been radical and dangerous slowly became nostalgic and quaint, while new forms of public space rose to eclipse its centrality. The story of decline and transformation is not one of disappearance, but of adaptation, as the Cavahane adjusted to the currents of empire and modernity, from dangerous to domestic. In earlier centuries, the Cavahane carried the fragrance of sedition. Sultans banned them, ulama debated them, spies haunted them. By the 18th century, however, their aura of danger had faded somewhat. Coffee was no longer novel. It had seeped into homes, palaces, and daily rituals. The Cavahane, once feared as an incubator of conspiracy, was domesticated. It became a place of routine sociability rather than revolutionary talk. Authorities still watched them, but the intensity of earlier prohibitions diminished. What had once been radical was now ordinary. The European café arrives. At the same time, European influence reshaped Ottoman urban culture. From the 18th century onward, European cafés began to appear in port cities like Smyrna, Salonika, and Istanbul, brought by merchants, diplomats, and expatriates. These establishments introduced new aesthetics: chairs and tables in place of divans, printed newspapers alongside cups, mirrors and chandeliers replacing smoky lamps. Where the Cavahane thrived on oral culture, storytellers, poets, gossip, the European café offered written culture, linking its patrons to newspapers, pamphlets, and novels. This subtle shift reflected the broader modernization of the empire, as literacy increased and print began to rival speech as the medium of the public sphere. For Ottoman elites eager to emulate European refinement, the café became a fashionable alternative to the Cavahane. To sit in a Parisian-style establishment, sipping coffee while reading a French newspaper, was a statement of modernity. The Cavahane, by contrast, began to seem rustic, a holdover of an older world. This perception did not destroy the Cavahane, but it relegated it to a different cultural tier, less elite, more populist, rooted in tradition rather than progress. The rise of tea. Another force of transformation was the rise of tea. By the late 19th century, as global trade routes shifted and tea became cheaper and more available, it began to rival and eventually surpass coffee as the Ottoman, and later Turkish, national drink. Tea was easier to prepare in large quantities, cheaper than imported Yemeni beans, and adaptable to domestic cultivation in the Black Sea region in the 20th century. Slowly, the steaming seive gave way to the tulip-shaped glass of tea. The Kavahane adapted, serving tea alongside coffee, but over time tea became dominant. The institution endured, but the drink that defined it shifted, altering its identity. Political shifts and regulation. The decline of the Kavahane was also tied to political change. As the empire modernized under the Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century, the state introduced new forms of surveillance and regulation. Coffee houses were still seen as places of potential unrest, especially as nationalist movements grew in the Balkans and Arab provinces. In Sarajevo, Belgrade, and Damascus, Kavahanes were closely monitored for signs of separatist agitation. Yet the conversations within were increasingly less radical, as newspapers and political clubs began to provide more organized forums for dissent. The Kavahane lost its monopoly as a house of dangerous talk, even as it remained a house of familiar comfort. The pull of nostalgia. As new spaces emerged, European cafés, salons, clubs, the Kavahane became associated with tradition and nostalgia. For many, it represented a simpler time, a link to fathers and grandfathers, to neighborhood life unshaken by the pace of modern change. In literature and poetry, the Kavahane was romanticized as a place of warmth and camaraderie, a hearth of memory. Travelers from Europe, once struck by its exoticism, now described it as quaint, a relic of a fading empire. Its decline was less a collapse than a transformation into a cultural symbol, persistence among the people. Yet even as elites drifted to European cafés and tea-displaced coffee, the Kavahane endured in working-class neighborhoods, small towns, and rural villages. It remained the center of male sociability, where men gathered to play tavla, smoke nargile, and share local news. Its simplicity was its strength. It did not require chandeliers or newspapers. It required only benches, a brazier, and a seive. While the empire modernized, the Kavahane persisted as the people's house, a reminder that not all cherished spaces yield easily to progress. Legacy of transformation. By the twilight of the Ottoman Empire, the Kavahane had lost its position as the crucible of urban dissent, but it had gained a new role as custodian of tradition. It survived by adapting, blending European influences with Ottoman roots, serving tea as well as coffee, offering newspapers alongside storytellers. It was no longer the dangerous novelty that sultans tried to suppress, but neither was it obsolete. It had become a layered institution, part living tradition, part nostalgic symbol, part modern cafe. The transformation of the Kavahane reflects the transformation of the empire itself. The Ottomans, once feared conquerors, became nostalgic symbols of a fading world. Like the empire, the Kavahane adapted to survive, but in doing so, it ceded some of its former power. It became less a space of rebellion and more a space of continuity, a reminder of identity in a changing world. And yet, decline did not mean disappearance. The Kavahane endured, not as it once was, but as it needed to be, flexible, resilient, rooted in the cup. Its transformation ensured that even as the empire fell, the Kavahane would remain, carried forward into the republics that succeeded it, lingering in the steam of coffee and tea wherever men gathered to speak. Though the Ottoman Empire collapsed in the early 20th century, its coffee houses did not vanish with it. Instead, they evolved, adapted, and echoed across new nations, leaving traces in Istanbul's neighborhoods, Sarajevo's cobbled alleys, Cairo's markets, and even the boulevards of Paris and the avenues of New York. The Kavahane, once feared as a breeding ground of sedition and cherished as a house of conversation, survives today as both tradition and legacy. To trace its echoes in the modern world is to see how an institution born of Yemeni beans and Ottoman ritual became part of a global culture. The Turkish Kavahane today. In Turkey, the Kavahane remains a familiar presence, though transformed by time. In cities and villages alike, Men still gather in simple coffee houses to sip Turk kahvesi, thick and bitter, served in small porcelain cups with a film of foam on top. Tavla boards rattle on tables, newspapers spread across laps, cigarettes or nargile smoke curl into the air. The setting may be humbler than in centuries past, but the essence remains, a place of sociability, of fellowship, of belonging. Many kahvehanes today are explicitly male spaces, continuing the gendered traditions of the Ottoman era. They are less centers of dangerous talk than of a routine community, retired men, workers, students, all sharing the same ritual of the cup. The rise of the modern cafe. Alongside these traditional kahvehanes, modern cafes flourish in Turkey's cities, blending Ottoman roots with European aesthetics. In Istanbul's Beyoğlu district, one can find chic coffee shops where espresso machines hiss alongside crevices simmering on sand. These establishments, frequented by women as well as men, by tourists as well as locals, represent a blending of cultures, the Ottoman kahvehane reborn as global cafe culture. The foam-topped cup still carries Ottoman memory, but it sits now beside lattes and cappuccinos. In these spaces, the echo of the kahvehane lingers, even as it mingles with new voices. Bosnia and the Balkans, living tradition. In the Balkans, the Ottoman legacy of coffee houses is preserved with remarkable fidelity. In Sarajevo, Mostar, and other Bosnian towns, Bosanska kafa, Bosnian coffee, is prepared almost identically to Ottoman Turkish coffee, served in copper sezes with small cups, accompanied by sugar cubes or Turkish delight. To share Bosnian coffee is not only to drink, but to perform a ritual of hospitality. The kahvehane remains central to Bosnian social life, a marker of identity that survived wars, occupations, and political upheaval. In Belgrade, Skopje, and across the Balkans, the tradition persists, a cultural inheritance from centuries of Ottoman presence. Even in regions where Ottoman rule is remembered with ambivalence, the coffee house endures as an unshakable legacy. Arab worlds, Cairo, Damascus, and beyond. In Cairo, the coffee house, or awa, remains a cornerstone of city life. Lined with chairs that spill into the street, filled with the smoke of shisha, they serve tea as often as coffee, but preserve the social spirit of the Ottoman kahvehane. Patrons gather to watch football matches, play backgammon, or listen to street musicians. In Damascus and Aleppo, despite the devastations of war, traditional coffee houses still echo with conversations and performances, keeping alive the oral culture that once defined Ottoman Syria. The Ottoman kahvehane was never erased. It became naturalized, woven into Arab urban identity, continuing as awas across the Middle East. The global spread, Europe and the Americas. The echoes of the kahvehane reached even further. In Vienna, Paris, and London, the European cafe of the 17th and 18th centuries was modeled, directly or indirectly, on Ottoman prototypes. These cafes became cradles of the Enlightenment, where philosophers debated, pamphlets circulated, and revolutions were imagined. The penny universities of London echoed the Ottoman Mektep-i Irfan, schools of knowledge. From Europe, cafe culture traveled to the Americas, where coffee houses in Boston and New York became meeting grounds for revolutionaries and thinkers. The genealogy is clear. The Ottoman kahvehane was the ancestor of the modern cafe, its DNA present in every Starbucks and sidewalk coffee shop today. From subversion to nostalgia, what was once feared as a nest of sedition has become, in many places, a symbol of cultural heritage. In Turkey, traditional kahvehanes are preserved as tourist sites as much as community spaces, celebrated for their atmosphere rather than feared for their politics. In Bosnia, the ritual of coffee is a marker of identity, treasured as a link to the past. In Cairo, awas are simultaneously modern meeting grounds and nostalgic echoes of Ottoman times. What rulers once tried to ban is now celebrated as heritage, its danger transmuted into charm. The ritual persists. At the heart of these echoes is the ritual of the cup. Whether in Istanbul or Sarajevo, Damascus or New York, the essence remains. Finely ground coffee, brewed slowly, served thick, sipped patiently. The sez, the foam, the small cup, all endure as symbols of continuity. Even in global chains, where frappuccinos and cappuccinos dominate. Turkish or Bosnian coffee is offered as a nod to tradition. The ritual persists because it answers a fundamental human need: to pause, to gather, to converse. The Kahvehane's legacy. The survival and transformation of the Kahvehane show how institutions adapt. It is no longer the feared incubator of dissent it once was, but its echoes continue to shape public life. The very idea of a coffee house as a place of conversation, leisure, and exchange is Ottoman in origin. Its legacy is global, its influence enduring. Wherever people gather over coffee, whether in a Sarajevo cafe or a New York coffee shop, they participate in a tradition that began in the smoky rooms of Istanbul in the 16th century. The Kahvehane today is not only a relic, but a living echo. It endures in the laughter of men over tavla, in the slow sip of Bosnian coffee, in the cosmopolitan buzz of Istanbul's cafés, and in the global ubiquity of coffee culture. It is an Ottoman gift to the world, transformed yet recognizable, diminished yet resilient. The empire that birthed it has fallen, but the Kahvehane survives, a reminder that empires may pass, but the rituals of community endure. The story of the Ottoman coffee house is the story of how a bean became a culture, how a drink became a stage for society, and how a simple ritual reshaped the rhythms of an empire. From the sacred vigils of Yemeni Sufis to the smoky corners of Istanbul's Kahvehane, coffee moved through the world not as a commodity alone, but as a medium of fellowship. Within each steaming cup was more than bitter liquid. There was poetry, politics, satire, gossip, faith, rebellion, and laughter. The Kahvehane revealed the Ottoman Empire to itself. It was a mirror of diversity, where Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Bosnians gathered under one roof. It was a crucible of equality, where carpenters could debate with scholars, janissaries could spar with poets, and merchants could exchange verses with preachers. It was a theater where metas spun tales, puppets mocked viziers, and poets recited verses to applause. And it was a parliament of sorts, where grievances about taxes or wars could be voiced beyond the ear of officialdom. In this way, the Kahvehane embodied both the vitality and the fragility of the empire. It was loved by the people and feared by their rulers, cherished as community and condemned as sedition. The authorities tried to silence it. Edicts were proclaimed, punishments enforced, bans repeated. Yet each prohibition was met with resistance. Coffee houses re-emerged in alleys, in barber shops, in hidden rooms. Patrons defied bans with laughter, satire, and secrecy. The Kahvehane endured because it answered a fundamental human need: the need to gather, to converse, to belong. In resisting its erasure, the people affirmed their own agency. No empire, however mighty, could strip away the simple pleasure of a shared cup. As centuries passed, the Kahvehane transformed. What was once feared as a nest of sedition became nostalgic, a link to tradition. European cafés rose in port cities. Newspapers replaced storytellers. Tea rivaled coffee. Yet the Kahvehane adapted, carrying its essence into new forms. In Sarajevo, it became Bosnian coffee culture. In Cairo, the Awa. In Istanbul, both humble neighborhood Kahvehanes and modern cosmopolitan cafés. Its DNA traveled further still, inspiring the European cafe and, through it, the global coffeehouse culture of today. Every Starbucks, every Parisian cafe, every bustling New York coffee shop carries echoes of the Ottoman Kahvehane, where the idea was born that coffee is not just a drink, but a space for community and conversation. What, then, is the legacy of the Ottoman coffee house? It is not only the foam on a sezv or the clatter of tavla pieces. It is the recognition that in the act of drinking together lies a form of power. The Kahvehane was a house of sociability, but it was also a house of autonomy, a place where ordinary men claimed their right to speak, to imagine, to belong. It shows us that fellowship is never neutral. It can comfort, it can inspire, it can resist. In every age, those who gather freely unsettle those who govern. And yet, the Kahvehane also reminds us of the endurance of simple rituals. Empires rise and fall, rulers ban and permit, but the sezv still boils, the foam still forms, the cup is still passed. Community persists in small acts, in a sip, A game, a story shared. The Ottoman coffee house teaches us that culture is not decreed from above, but brewed from below, in the everyday gatherings of people who refuse to be silent. In every cup today, whether in Sarajevo or Istanbul, in Cairo or New York, the Kavahane whispers its history. It tells of sultans and poets, janissaries and storytellers, prohibitions and resistances. It tells of how a bean became a bridge between peoples, a spark of dissent, a cradle of culture. And above all, it tells us that as long as people gather to talk and to share, no empire ever truly ends.